Hi, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our show today. We have a wonderful guest today. We have a person who's really engaged, who's put his life and his money and his whole passion into saving the climate. As you see behind me, here we have a wonderful picture of the Earth. Everything is about the Earth. We live in the Earth, we breathe in the Earth, we take care of the Earth, and the question is, what's going to be the future of the Earth? I've been reading these articles that Tamarkin, this is my guest, has been writing on his wonderful site called climatesite.com, and I'm quite amazed by it. Tomer, first of all, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for inviting us to your office.
All right, well, great to be with you. Thank you. But I have to kind of say something with regard to your introduction here, and that is the fact that really we don't have to save the climate. The climate is fine.
The climate's fine. So that's a phenomenal thing to the segue to the show, because I really want to understand and tell the viewers, what is this whole thing about climate change? Why people always hit the climate change? Where did it come from? Where did it start? And why we're so obsessed about it?
In a very recent interview on CBS 60 Minutes, Bill Gates, in fact, talked about climate change and the need to address it. And he actually talked about several other things, which ultimately looped back to the concept of population reduction, which is really a silly notion, but it's one that somehow is associated with climate change and the use of fossil fuels. Climate change was really adopted by the Club of Rome in their first 1968 inauguratory meeting, which was led by David Rockefeller at his home in Italy, of all places. And what the group decided was that they could use the possibility, or in their mind, probability of climate change as a reason to stimulate population reduction worldwide, leading to their kind of pet argument, if you will, set of beliefs that the world really needed to be united under a one world government.
I'm really stunned by that because, in the last few weeks, everyone's been talking about the Great Reset, especially the COVID and lockdown and so forth, and the world is about to change to a fourth industrial revolution. So, and when I read in your website about the idea about population reduction, about the Club of Rome, as you just mentioned, I really was stunned by it. So,
well, actually,
go ahead, continue.
Well, actually, that was the start of the movement. As I said, that was in the late 1968. But the actual movement really was cast in concrete, if you will, in a 1975 seminar, which was led by the famous anthropologist, Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead in this conference was joined by the author of a famous book at the time called The Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich, as well as a gentleman named John Holdren. And the three of them held this seminar, which they called The Atmosphere, Endangered and Endangering. And they actually proposed that carbon dioxide be considered a pollutant of all things. And actually, although that sounds funny, because we breathe carbon dioxide, people on submarines breathe up to 5,000 parts per million carbon dioxide. It's certainly not a pollutant. But the Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama actually has language in what they call their endangerment ruling that CO2 is in fact a pollutant.
Wow. So if you can tell the audience, because you're saying basically CO2 is not this dangerous gaseous material that we're breathing in, and just the opposite, we create carbon dioxide. So what is this whole thing about, the greenhouse and the gases, and it causes all these, the heat? Is it man-made? Is it natural? What's the story about that?
Well, except for heat coming from the center of the Earth, which is a function of density and gravity and other issues I won't attempt to talk about today. But other than that latent heat within the Earth itself, all heat on the Earth comes from the sun. So the concept of global warming as a function of gases trapped in the troposphere layer of the atmosphere, it was really based on the early works of a gentleman named Savant Arrhenius, as well as Fourier, Elholm, and John Tyndall. And these scientists had the incorrect idea at the time, the late 1800s, that greenhouse gases like water vapor actually acted like giant panes of glass in the sky, trapping heat on the ground, like you said a minute ago, much as greenhouses work. And originally, Arrhenius calculated that carbon dioxide gas actually absorbs and emits more infrared radiation of heat than water vapor. However, Arrhenius and others realized that the absorbing spectra, or the specific frequencies of that infrared radiation from the sun, of water vapor and carbon dioxide overlap. And that's a very important point, because you have to look at the net effect based on what we call a molecule by molecule basis. Since the atmosphere contains about 20 times more water vapor than carbon dioxide, water vapor is actually absorbing much more infrared radiation than carbon dioxide. Arrhenius realized this, as did Tyndall, and they both stated that water vapor is really the most important of these, what we call polyatomic, meaning gases that have more than two elements in them, such as carbon dioxide or water vapor, which is evaporated water, H2O. And Arrhenius actually reversed his hot Earth position in a little known paper in 1906, but the paper was written in German, which is why it's little known. It was only recently translated to English. We have a copy of it on our website. And he actually concluded that we needed to be much more concerned about a potential ice age. And his final thinking late in life was that carbon dioxide was a good thing, in that any warming it could produce would offset that potential ice age and actually help green the planet with more plant growth. So the bottom line is, contrary to the myth, if you will, of the climate alarmists, is that water vapor is by far the most plentiful of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And Arrhenius, his background, well, he was an electrochemist, and he based his understanding on the best science of the time, which was actually produced by scientific luminaries, Faraday, Fourier, and others that we remember from high school, actually, including my great-grandfather, Thomas E. Thorpe, who was knighted in the UK after writing 20-some books on physical chemistry. And he, in fact, became the chief chemist to the British government and director of the government laboratories. So collectively, there was a great deal of knowledge at the time that Arrhenius and Tyndall and these other gentlemen could rely on, but they were missing the key ingredient, which was quantum mechanics. Now, later in the early 1900s, Max Planck developed our modern understanding of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and another German scientist, Karl Schwarzschild, focused his studies on greenhouse gases. And together, Planck and Schwarzschild showed us how greenhouse gases, in fact, act and why they behave the way they do. And these greenhouse molecules, well, they do in fact absorb infrared energy, but they dissipate that energy very, very quickly. And how quickly? In about a million billionth of a second. A million billionth of 1 second, which we in physics call a femtosecond, or 10 to the minus 15th seconds, unimaginably short period of time. And then that energy is radiated in a three-dimensional Stradian pulse, and most of it actually passes to outer space. And given the extremely low spatial density of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because they form a very, very small percentage of the total gases, which are mostly nitrogen and oxygen in the troposphere, because of this very low spatial density, and given the velocity of light, This infrared radiation, once it hits the Earth, is only on the Earth for a very short period of time, again, measured in femtoseconds.
Wow, that's
Now,
incredible.
let's take that one step further. This radiated energy, which, as I said, is emitted in a three-dimensional Stradian fashion, it actually follows the inverse square law. And the inverse square law means that the energy level is reduced by a factor of 4 every time the distance doubles. So if you double the distance twice, the amount of available energy that can be detected is only 1/16. And this brings us to what is perhaps, in my opinion, the most important point of all. And that gets down to the fundamental law of mass and energy conservation. In physics, you probably learned this because of your background at the Bronx High School of Science.
Mhm.
You remember the conservation of mass and energy. And engineers probably would think of this in terms of the 3 laws of thermodynamics, but they are predicated on the concept of conservation of mass and energy. Simply put, that means you can't get more energy, more heat out of a system than you originally put into it. So what that really tells us is that any warming due to energy supplied by the sun to a greenhouse gas, which was prior radiated from the Earth, that energy, once it has been radiated from the greenhouse gas going back to the Earth, it can in no way increase the temperature of the Earth. The entire mechanism can certainly delay cooling, but it simply can't increase warming.
Okay, I understand that. So
So
my
let's take that
question,
even one final
okay,
step,
go
perhaps
ahead.
two steps further. Carbon dioxide is a man-made forcer, which is what this conversation is about,
Hmm.
saving climate due to man's activities here on Earth. So carbon dioxide as a man-made forcer of warming is even more unlikely because the increases in carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere, they always follow warming. They do not precede warming. Carbon dioxide comes after it gets hot. Why? Well, because there's 50 to 60 times more carbon dioxide in solution in the oceans and other water bodies here on Earth. And this follows something called Henry's gas law, which is defined by temperature and partition coefficients. And greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, therefore, really serve to delay cooling on the Earth, but they can in no way create warmth, additional warmth on the Earth. And even Tyndall wrote this in his 1875 book, that greenhouse gases in the atmosphere actually act like a blanket covering the Earth at night. If you didn't have it, the Earth would get down to 100 degrees below zero in the early mornings. Most telling of all is the fact that our daily monitoring of CO2 levels at the Mauna Loa Keeling site in Hawaii, which by coincidence happens to sit on top of a very active volcanic region with an active volcano just kilometers away. And active volcanoes emit carbon dioxide. That's a whole different issue. But regardless, the monitoring of CO2 levels at the Mauna Loa station, they actually show that CO2 levels continue to rise each year, and they've risen by a very small percentage, perhaps 3 or 4 parts per million over the last year. Well, that's phenomenal. Why? Well, because we've been in a pandemic, and over the last year, we've actually used 30% less fossil fuels worldwide across important segments like transportation, commercial, and industrial use of fuels. So given the fact that we use 30% less fossil fuels, why do we see a continued escalation of the level of CO2 in the atmosphere? Well, what that tells us, as I mentioned a minute ago, is that CO2, in fact, is being produced by nature from natural sources, principally from water bodies. Man is not a contributor of measurable, material amounts of carbon dioxide. And again, the key phrase is measurable and material amounts. Nature is.
Can I say for 1 second there? Because that's stunning what you just
Please.
said to me right now. You just said to me right now that basically the COVID year, the lockdown has proven that because we've used, less machinery and less transportation and so forth, we should assume that basically carbon dioxide should have gone down. Just the opposite, it's gone up. So that basically is it's a proof, you could say. No one planned it that way, but it's a proof that basically that man-made climate change does not exist. Because if it did exist, basically carbon dioxide should have gone down in the last 12 months. It hasn't. It's risen up because of nature. So how does this work? That nature, you explained before, but what has to do with what about planets and what about the sun and movements and tilt the earth? Does that also contribute to that?
Well, again, with your background, you certainly took algebra, geometry, maybe trigonometry, maybe second year algebra in high school, and you certainly know what the slope of a curve is on a graph. And if you look at what I referred to as the Keeling station and what we call the Keeling curve, which is a plot of CO2 on one axis, the amount of CO2 versus time on the horizontal axis, we see a plot that looks like a 45-degree slope from the time that this monitoring activity started in 1971. So what I basically just said is that from 1971 to 2021, when we look at this Keeling curve, it's a straight line for practical purposes at a 45-degree angle going up. Yet the use of fossil fuels from 1980, certainly through 2020, has really increased in spats, if you will, due to the development of the third world and China, India, and other countries building new power plants, meaning that 1 year you have X amount of additional CO2 produced, in Y year you have twice that amount. But this curve does not reflect that. It's just a straight line.
And what does that tell us? The straight line means that
It means that this carbon dioxide is coming from a very, very, very large natural source that has nothing to do on a measurable basis, nothing to do on a material basis with man's activities. It's nature at work.
That's stunning. So basically, this young lady, Greta, who is the granddaughter of the famous scientist you mentioned before, seems that she misunderstood her good-grandfather's conclusions. He himself said, basically, in the end of his life, that carbon dioxide is good for the earth, and that he was afraid there might be an ice age if not enough balance between the heat and infrared, and again, the heating system, as well as the carbon dioxide. But you mentioned before, and this is I really want to address the audience, you mentioned about the Club of Rome, I believe, and the idea of population reduction. Is that still on the agenda? Is there still this whole global Great Reset? Is that still there? Or do we have to just say, it's the things have changed, or is there something else really luring in the dark?
Well, yes, but I kind of want to loop back again and answer because you just actually asked 3 questions in a row. And I think one of the things that you started to ask about is whether or not we can actually prove empirically, demonstrably, that climate change as a function of man's activity, in fact, exists. You asked me, can we prove global warming exists as a function of man's activity? And the answer to that, simply stated, is no, we cannot. What we can prove is that climate change exists and that it's natural. So if you think about it, the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. The Grand Canyon is about 4.5, or actually 450 million years old. So the Grand Canyon gives us a snapshot of roughly 10% of the Earth's age. Now, taking this one step further, you have people today, modern man, if you will, some scientists and a lot of politicians trying to use a 50 to 100-year time frame to pinpoint a change in the trends here on Earth. But yet this 50 to 100-year time frame is only something in the area of 0.0000001% of the total age of the Earth. And it's really an absurdity to suggest that we can say that something measured for such a short period of time is a trend that man created. And I say this really based on the fact that geological samples show us that the Earth has been much warmer in the past. It's also been much cooler in the past. And our current level of CO2, well, we're close to a CO2 drought. We only have 414, I think, as of this morning when I looked, parts per million of CO2 as measured in Hawaii. And yet we had as much as 3,500 parts per million of CO2 millions of years in the past, when both plant and animal life have been much more abundant. So we can actually prove that climate change does change. Climate change happens, but it's a result of natural variations in solar activity, in planetary motions, coupled with the fact that the Earth itself sits on a 24-degree, roughly, tilt on its axis. And the fact that the Earth circles the sun in an elliptical orbit, which causes a precession, which plays havoc with weather conditions. And other natural events like volcanic eruptions, meteor strikes, atmospheric and oceanic oscillations, well, they contribute to things we've all heard of, such as El Nino and La Nina, and they create further changes in the weather, not climate.
Well, behind me, the pictures of the Earth, and I look at the Earth and I see this phenomenal, massive interaction of wind and of rains and of different types of forces and so forth, and the sun giving its own heat, and the moon and the earth and so forth. And you say to yourself, how can it possibly be that man, and basically, quote unquote, the industrial age is just basically 100 years old. That's all the industrial age really is. That man could produce so much destruction in the last 100 years to make this climate change. So your logic is correct, and your empirical evidence is correct that it can't be man that's done all this climate change. Has there any now? So all these computer programs and all these models and so forth, where do they come from? How do these people? How does these people get the Michael Mann, for instance? How does he get his ideas from? His input leading to his output, that there is climate change, and it doesn't seem logical at all.
Well, you bring up a very good point once again. All climate change predictions result from computer models. And these computer models are based on the unproven theories, if you will, of man. Computer models are programs that require some initial data to be entered. And if that initial data is flawed based on false, unprovable assumptions, then the output of that model is absolutely meaningless. And actually, NASA, which has devoted some of its effort to teaching areas of climate change, if you will, in curriculum to the schools. On their website, they actually have things that are scientifically and technically inaccurate. And some of their employees and university associates have actually misrepresented the very basic concept of the scientific method. Science doesn't work on consensus. Science is based upon the ability to falsify a theory, not how many people agree with the original proposed theory. And I think Albert Einstein famously said something to the effect that 1,000 guys can prove me right and it means nothing. But one guy proves me wrong and I'm dead.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Michael Mann.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Michael Mann. He actually developed a poster child, if you will, of the climate alarmism movement, which we call the hockey stick curve, which I refer to as the hockey shtick, as in Yiddish.
I like that. That's clever. Go ahead.
All right. And if we
Yeah.
look at Dick, which is based entirely on his talking about his now bogus theory, two Canadian scientists and mathematicians, McIntyre and McKittrick, they actually went through his math and they proved that it was based on hot air, meaningless numbers, a gross misuse of statistics.
Hmm.
And wow, Michael Mann's hockey stick curve is fake. Well, actually, it is. And in 2004, MIT's Technology Review, which is an esteemed publication, they wrote an article about this work based on the work of McKittrick and McIntyre, and it was called Hockey Stick Bombshell. The hockey stick is fake. But anyway,
Was there a lawsuit about this? Something? Was there a lawsuit?
yeah, anyway, there's a well-known lawsuit that's actually been resolved,
Hmm.
wherein Dr. Mann actually filed suit against somebody who was a well-known climatologist in Canada named Tim Ball. And Tim Ball questioned Mann's background and his integrity, if you will, by saying these goofy things. And Mann actually got upset with him and filed a lawsuit against him for defamation, effectively. And in this lawsuit, Ball's attorneys, they requested that Mann provide what we call his mathematical proofs, or the data sets that he used to develop his hockey stick curve. And for about 3 years, Mann refused to provide any data. Why? Because he didn't have it, or if he did, it was made up. And ultimately, the judge became so exasperated that in the Supreme Court of Vancouver, they dismissed the lawsuit to Dr. Ball's favor, meaning Mann lost, Ball won, and the attorneys got about $800,000 in legal fees, unfortunately.
Wow. Wow. So you see a person who's trying to falsify data, take on the court system for 3 years, always
Oh,
delaying justice.
that suit was much longer than 3 years.
More than three
I,
years. Wow.
I mean, the suit ran on, I think, for close to 8 years.
8 years. 8 years because of a person's ego. And then eventually he couldn't prove anything, so the judge just got rid of him. That says a
Absolutely.
lot.
Yeah, and I think it says even more that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, Michael Mann was the lead contributing scientist in their first, what we call their reports,
Mhm.
and the ARs, number one. And he actually used his hockey stick curve in that report. And once it became known that that was, as I said, bogus, a strong word, the IPCC removed the notion of that hockey stick curve, and they now distanced themselves from Dr. Mann.
Wow. Yeah, preparing for this interview with you, as you know, I mentioned before that I went to Brown Clinical Science, and I still love physics, and I'm always fascinated by physics, mathematics, and all different types of branches of the sciences. And knowing about your family, that you come from a distinguished family, as mentioned before, have a PhD and a person who's a sir in the United Kingdom. Um, I see that you have a quest for knowledge, and you really have a passion for the truth, and for scientific truth, and intellectual truth, and also moral truth. Yeah, I also was in my interview, not my interview, in my study preparing for this interview. I saw there's other professors and PhDs like Dr. Happer from Princeton, so forth. Anyone else besides him or others you can tell us about that also believe what you believe, and that basically this whole climate change is a hoax. It's a fraud. It's not man-made. It's made by politicians, by world leaders, by those who want to promote and promulgate the same concept of the agenda of the Club of Rome now, the Great Reset.
Well, yes, certainly. In fact, I'm glad you brought up that word hoax, because leading politicians in our country on one side of the aisle have repeatedly said that it's a hoax. Hoax really isn't the right word, because a hoax is a joke, something that's said or done in jest. But climate change and its implications really are no joke. The common refrain that 97% of scientists, all scientists, agree that climate change comes from man and his use of fossil fuels is absolutely untrue. And it's actually based on a paper written by Jonathan Cook and a couple of other people in 2013. And in the Cook et al. Paper, they pointed out that of 11,940 papers they surveyed, in the abstracts, 0.5%, 0.5% of those papers actually used the word anthropogenic global warming or global warming caused by man. The vast majority of those papers really didn't touch that issue. But yet the paper was so poorly written that people came away somehow with this crazy idea that 97%, again, based on 11,940 papers of, quote, all scientists, agree that global warming as a factor of man's use of fossil fuels does in fact exist. Nothing could be further from the truth. But anyway, we probably should talk about how many people, scientists today, really do believe that man creates global warming through his use of fossil fuels. And the actual answer is somewhere in the area of less than 50%, and certainly less than 30% of those scientists that actually study the matter in detail would go so far as to say that we can conclude, or there's a high probability that man actually creates or stimulates climate change. Other scientists, probably another 20%, will say something to the effect that, yeah, maybe an increase in carbon dioxide does increase climate change to a very small extent, or certainly an increase in the use of asphalt as an example, and the increase of use of heat sources in urban heat zones contribute to warming. But that has nothing to do with climate change and carbon dioxide. And then there are other scientists that we'll talk about who actually say unequivocally no. Use of fossil fuel, man-made produced carbon dioxide, which, as we said a few minutes ago, is immeasurable, has no measurable effect on the temperature, what they commonly call the global mean temperature of the Earth.
You know, before we mentioned the scientific method, David Hume, the philosopher, said that idea about cause and effect. Does there really exist something cause and effect? And the scientific method basically is out to not prove anything, but like you mentioned before, disprove. We don't know tomorrow if the sun will rise. We assume the sun will rise, and hopefully it will. And we hopefully assume that, if I throw something in the air, it'll go down, there'll be gravity and so forth, it'll come back down. But these all cause and effect. And as a person, as a rabbi, as we study Torah and so forth, it's the same thing. The Torah Hashem tells us in the Torah that because he made these laws, it happens. In other words, there's cause and effect because of God created these laws. In other words, if God wanted to suspend these laws, he could. Meaning, again, the concept of scientific method. Nothing is out to prove something is right. That's what we call the theory of relativity, the theory of this, the theory of that. So when people, like you mentioned before, people come along and say, well, majority people, there's no majority. And as right now, shown us. My second question is based on this, because of there is no proof, and it's basically politically made, and there's other issues behind it. Is something about eugenics also involved in this? Is also something about changing the world dynamic in terms of the economy and so forth, about energy, rebasing the haves and have-nots and so forth? Is that also part of this whole political or sociological, social movement of climate change, quote unquote?
Well, yes. I mean, let's get back to the Bill Gates interview on CBS 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago. Gates certainly suggests that population is a problem. But if we look at the most recent UN position statement, which they call Agenda 30, it no longer has reduction of population as a goal. Agenda 30 does have as a goal an energy goal, which, if I can read it, It says to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Now, having said that, a recent report from the UN dated February 6th, if I recall, 2021, on the subject of sustainability, that report is suggestive by innuendo that there is a need for population reduction. And many scientists express concerns about the sustainability of our crop growth and our livestock growth, which is obviously needed to feed 7 billion people. And I think really that was the genesis, if you will, of Gates's comments in that 60 Minutes interview. Mm-hmm. But regarding eugenics, population reduction being forced through the practice of eugenics. Eugenics is something that's still discussed at world leadership levels, under the table perhaps, but it's discussed. And one of the Margaret Mead Conference or seminar members, we talked about that earlier, was John Holdren. And John Holdren, in fact, served as chief science advisor to President Obama. Holdren wrote a famous book, and if I remember page 277, I believe, there are a couple of pages starting at page 277, which really articulates the need for eugenics and forced population reduction.
That to me is very, very, I shouldn't say the word, it makes me very upset, especially someone who's Jewish.
And yes, I mean, I've toured camps in Germany. Yeah. Behind me under my piano, there's a picture I took, and it says in about 6 or 7 languages, never again.
Never again, exactly right. Never again. What genocide, the theory of genocide, the theory of the master race, the Übermenschen, of having the superiors, wherever these superiors want to be, what they think that they have the best intellect or the best talents, whatever, and the rest of the rest of the nations of the world should be wiped off the face of the earth. That is horrible. That's terrible. That's immoral. That is murder. That is basically against the whole concept of the Torah, where God told us that each human being is made in God's image, and the idea of sanctity of life. So this whole eugenics is basically is a very immoral movement, and it should have been stopped in 1945. To hear that in 2001 it's still going on is just mind-boggling, and just literally the word disgusting comes to mind.
I was just thinking of that word disgusting, and I'm also thinking of something that's happening in our country and probably throughout the world, but certainly in the US, which is this cancellation movement. We cancel everything that we learned in the past. We canceled World War II. We canceled the Holocaust. Can't talk about it anymore. Most recently, I think we canceled Dr. Seuss books.
Yeah. Now, and interesting.
But, and this is an important but.
Yeah.
You mentioned Greta and Arrhenius. Well, Arrhenius was in fact Greta's great-grandfather, and he did finally conclude in his later life, as I said, that carbon dioxide is a good thing because if nothing else, it helps grow plants and feed cattle. And that's very important to sustain people. We have to understand that carbon dioxide is part of the life cycle. All human life, all life, it doesn't matter, plant life, amoebas, protozoas, lower species up to humans are carbon-based. And given the fact that we're carbon-based, we need carbon to survive. Where do plants get their carbon to grow? Where do they get their energy from? The sun and from carbon dioxide. The same is true with humans. Mm-hmm. As I said, Arrhenius figured that out in his later life. And to answer your question about Greta, I don't want to go off on a political tangent here, but I think that Greta is very young, and her father's first name is Savant, in probably patrilineal honor, if you will, of his grandfather. And the parents, just with the famous composer Mozart, the parents forced their beliefs on Greta and are trying to capitalize on Greta and make money off of Greta.
I believe that too.
I mean,
Yeah.
Mozart's father certainly did that to Mozart in his very early lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's the exact same syndrome that I see here with Greta Thunberg.
I agree with you. The thing, when people talk about climate change, I understand where they're coming from. Everybody has good intentions, so to speak. Those who believe in it, those who've been duped by it. Their intention is to save the earth. The intention is to save life. If that's the case, then everybody's united on one platform, which is to save life. The question is, how do we get there? You've just shown to me, and from others videos I've seen, and from other sources and so forth, and especially your wonderful site, climatesite.com. I recommend everyone to go to climatesite.com. Climate site, the word site, climate, CLIMATE, site, CITE.com, and you'll see the wonderful articles there. But you'll also see something else, that the proof is really in the pudding. There has been no proof at all about man-made climate change whatsoever. Climate change exists. Yes, it does exist, but that's based on nature. The creations that Hashem meaning the name of God, that God did, and the part of the rules of the world that God has created, but it's not man-made. Now, that being the case, it's not man-made, then we just talked about global reduction through the global reset of population. So the question I tell the audience, who will be reduced? Will it be the people in Africa? Will it be those in China? Will it be those in Asia? Will it be those in the Middle East? We together as a world community have to come and understand that the elites of the world, just like they did 70 years ago, quote unquote, those elites who had the uber-mentioned idea, the Superman wanted to take over the world and get rid of those they didn't believe were fitting to be part of the world community. That's happening nowadays in 2021. So my question to you, what are you doing about this? How are you going to re-educate the youth? Because I myself grew up on this nonsense, and I'm recently been awakened, enlightened, and it reminds me of basically when Abraham was enlightened, 4,000 years ago, and he realized the child sacrifices of his time was false, the religions of his times were false, the idol worshiping of his time was false. Now this new idol called climate change is taken upon the modern youth. What are you doing to change it? And can their mindset be changed in time?
Well, getting back to that word eugenics has actually two meanings. One is the reduction of population through a variety of means, which can include killing people or causing people to die a slow death through lack of energy. It can include introducing compounds, chemicals in water supplies that cause sterilization. And this, in fact, is happening, and we can provide documentation to that effect. But the other, perhaps as important attribute of eugenics is that it implies genetic engineering, which is a phrase going back to Hitler's time and the Holocaust and the superior race. So we have to look at those two components of eugenics, and we've got to stamp that out. And we do that by education and bringing this to the attention of people worldwide. So actually, in answer to your question, why have I taken this on? My father, who happened to be a physicist, PhD, and an EDD, meaning Doctor of Education, as well as a Doctor of Philosophy Physics, he taught me at a very early age that if you see a problem, you really need to fix it. Don't complain about it, just fix it. So when I look at all of the very, very well qualified scientists, and there are many out there, so I've met most of them, people like Will Happer, Willie Soon, John Christie, Roy Spencer, Tim Ball, Richard Lindzen, just to name a few off the top of my head. They all have been refuting this man-made warming and climate change theory, AKA nonsense, for many years, upwards of 20 years. And I have a personal friend in the UK that I've spent a lot of time with in cities around the country, Lord Christopher Monton, the famous Lord Monton, who is known to do strange things like jump out of airplanes in order to enter a compound where a climate change seminar was being held, but they wouldn't let him in because of his position. Lord Monton actually led this dissenting movement, if you will, 20 years ago. But the problem that we have with these very, very good, reputable, honest scientists is they're just that. They're very good, reputable, honest scientists. They live in their own specific world, and that world can be very limiting. They spend their time on matters of physics, matters of chemistry, matters of biology, matters of geology, even geography, meteorology, but none of them yet, this is what we're attempting to do, but none of them have yet put all the pieces of this global warming problem together. And therefore, they simply don't appreciate the massive societal and financial impact of global warming. And in fact, most scientists would never use the word fraud. And if they saw this interview of yours, they would be criticizing me for using the word fraud. But I stand by it. It's fraud. It's fraud on a massive basis. My personal mission is to really change this and get the word out to the people, not the political leaders and the policymakers, but the people. And once the people understand this, the policymakers and the politicians will change. And those new political leaders will correct this, as you said, disgusting situation.
I totally agree with you, and I commend you for that. It's wonderful. It's horrible to see that in 2021, good people are being manipulated by those who have a sinister agenda, whatever the reason they have that for. Either they, quote unquote, they believe they're saving the earth, or they do want to have a master race, or they do want to have, the earth only for those they think is deemed worthy to live, which is just outrageous, that people's lives, people's dreams means nothing to them. Is there anything you're doing in terms of books or movies that or articles that you're bringing out to the world? Anyone else has joined your cause?
Well, yes, I've written lots of articles and several chapters in various books, this being the latest, along with Dr. George Chillingar. Recently, I had a feature article in a magazine called Shale. Obviously, by the name Shale, we think of oil and gas, coal. And my article in Shale really explains where energy on this planet comes from. And it comes from fossil fuels, meaning petroleum, natural gas, coal, and nuclear. Nuclear has a very important role to play, but it doesn't come from solar cells and windmills. Those are not material sources of energy. In fact, it takes more energy to produce solar cells and place them than you get back from them in terms of energy produced for the first 4 years of their life. And they only last 25 years, so that's not a good use of money. But again, having said that, more directly, we've written a book, which is available on Amazon.com, called Don't Be Scared of Climate Change. And the book, in fact, has been introduced by Pat Boone in Hollywood. He has a video on our website endorsing the book and talking about his experiences. But I think the most important thing of all that we're doing is that we're in the process of writing a full-length, action-packed thriller movie to teach people the truth about this fraud and deception and non-science, which we call man-made climate change, and how this man-made climate change fraud will lead to bankrupt countries around the world and destroy the futures for generations to come. And the name of our proposed movie, and we hope that it will be filmed and released here over the next year to 2 years, is called Mango, like the fruit, Mango the movie. And it will feature all of the leading PhDs to explain the real science, but in fairly simple to understand ways. That's very important because, as an example, we have a president here in our country, the United States, that is making climate change his primary agenda item, spending trillions of dollars of taxpayer money on it, canceling key necessities like the Keystone pipeline, XL Keystone pipeline. But if you were to talk to the president privately, he doesn't have any understanding whatsoever of the scientific issues surrounding climate change. It's a buzzword to him. We have to turn that around, and this movie will help do that. The plot,
I hope
the
so.
plot, the plot, because I know you have some. Well, gosh, I looked at your biography and I saw that you attended, if I remember, the New York Academy of the Arts. So
Yes.
you have a filmmaking background. So you understand the concept of the through line and the concept of a treatment.
Mhm.
We have a through line and plot for the movie, which is posted on our website, and we're in the process of writing a treatment for Hollywood. And obviously, we're looking for financial backers to support us, to support the production of the movie.
I really wish you luck on that. Maybe I can be part of the movie itself. Who knows? You never know. It'd be great.
We need a good writer.
Okay, I can write, and I'll show you a sample. If you like it, you can hire me. But I tell you something else. It's more important than about the small joke right now. But yeah, the Mango movie is really amazing. Where'd you get that title Mango from? What's it to do with climate change?
Well, along with the through line, which we have on our website, we actually have a separate article called Penelope's Story. And Penelope will be a semi-fictitious, semi-real person. Penelope will actually be the star of the movie, so to speak. And in a very early life, living in southern Florida, she was able to enjoy mangoes that were raised on her grandfather's farm.
Mm-hmm.
However, due to circumstances in her family, Penelope had to move to a northern area. And in that northern area, they're just a few degrees too cold to raise mangoes. But
In
she actually,
Florida?
in
Is in
Florida,
Florida?
very,
Okay.
very north panhandle. You're
Okay.
familiar with
Yeah.
Florida. It gets pretty cold up there. It
Right.
freezes there, as you found out 2 weeks ago, along with Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So in any event, when Penelope moved to northern Florida in the mid-70s, she thought, well, everybody's talking about climate change. So maybe 10 or 20 years from now, I can grow my mangoes.
Mm.
So every year she would look at what's called the hardiness guide to plant species, published by the US Department of Agriculture. She would eagerly read the latest version, trying to figure out when mangoes would grow in her new, homestead area. And here it's now 2020, and she still can't grow mangoes because the climate simply has not changed.
Wow.
And we actually developed a movie based on that very simple theme, having to do with common sense.
Now,
A farmer who believes in the Farmer's Almanac would know exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Or anybody who has seen evidence of heat rising in the home,
Right.
where it's 70 degrees downstairs and 100 degrees in their attic, they know that heat rises. This plays a very major role in climate change. And yet these two things have not happened in such a way or to such a degree that Penelope can realize her dream, which I suspect is having a mango farm in the large island of Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
So hence the basic plot. I won't give much more away in the movie, but it's an action-packed thriller. It's not just fruit.
First of all, the idea of the mangoes to me is a very poetic concept. Of here of a girl waiting to grow the mangoes because she's been told over and over again, climate change is going to happen. The earth is going to heat up, and and she can't move because she's poor, but she's living in North Florida, and she's waiting for the day that North Florida will finally be hot enough to grow mangoes. That's very poetic. And then the action adventure and action packed, it really sounds great. Before you mentioned before about Texas, so hope the audience understands that that joke when we were talking about Texas, none of us were laughing at the tragedy that was happening through Texas. We feel tremendous sympathy and empathy for all those who had this terrible 2 weeks in Texas, and especially also the fact that their bill has been raised from $50 per megawatt to $17,000 per megawatt. Is outrageous. But
Megawatt hour.
megawatt hour, right? It's just outrageous. Just to conclude,
Well, that's good. Let's just talk about that for
okay.
a quick point. Why and how did that happen? Well, in the power generation, and I have power generation experience in my background, and I've testified before the Public Utility Commission in Texas, and I lived in Texas for 10 years.
Mm.
What basically happened is that Texas has what we call a total generation capacity, which is defined in megawatt, terawatt hours. And in the power generation business, you cannot actually, you can simply not allow yourself to be put in a position where you have to exercise 100% of the available power generation capability you have. Why? Because of plant outages, shortages of supplies, problems with one of, say, four, as an example, with a nuclear facility. One nuclear reactor goes down, you just lost 25% of your power. So the long and the short of it is what happened 2 weeks ago in Texas is that for political reasons, they put themselves in a position where about 8% of their power would come from solar and wind turbines, solar cells and wind turbines, which work very well in the summertime. However, when it got very cold and snowy, the solar cells, the solar panels produce far less power than their what we call nameplate rating suggested they could produce. And at the same time, ERCOT, because Texas is very unique, it doesn't talk to the rest of the United States in terms of power. They produce their own power. They don't import it from Arkansas or New Mexico or Oklahoma. And the organization responsible for the management of power in Texas, as I said, is ERCOT. And ERCOT made some bad decisions when their nuclear station lost a large percentage of its capability. And some of their gas plants were losing output. And what happened is that ERCOT selectively denied power to key rural areas of the state, but it happens that those key areas were responsible for oil production, natural gas production, and the movement of those commodities, which are the various things required for those gas plants to produce at maximum efficiency. So it would be disingenuous of us to blame the entire problem on renewables. But on the other hand, when they actually designed the entire system of energy production, they should have never put themselves in a position where they were heavily reliant on these renewable powers, meaning solar cells and the wind turbines, because there could be certain times of the year. This, by the way, happened in 2009. It certainly happened in 2011. So this is nothing new in Texas. You can't put yourself in a position where a periodic event, and it's not a catastrophic event, it's a periodic event, causes you to lose a significant amount of what we call dispatchable power. Dispatchable power means that a guy in an operating station at Texas Utilities can turn that power source on and off in a period of a few hours. You can't do that with solar cells when the sky's gray and you've got 6 inches of snow on top of them. So in a nutshell, that's what happened in Texas.
Well, First of all, this has been the most fascinating hour that I've spent with the guests in recent times. We've covered so much ground, scientifically, politically, morally, and also in terms of, should we say, marketing. And what I mean by that, because a bag of goods was sold to us, to the youth of the world, the last two generations, that there is carbon dioxide and it's about to destroy us, and it's growing and growing and growing to the point where we're just going to shut off the climate, and there'd be no more air, and there'd be no more ability to have production of food and so forth, and the whole world will be destroyed, and we have to save the planet. That's the way we grew up. And you can see now Greta, the great granddaughter, Siobhan, has the same belief, and she's been being manipulated, which is very, very sad to see. It's and there she is telling the other kids of the world about the terrible end of time. And it's, so to speak, I heard, was watching
And she's not only telling other children, but she goes before the United Nations with the Secretary of the United Nations and is telling the whole world through the political establishment of the United Nations these things.
That's
So
horrible.
she's getting a tremendous, free broadcasting network, if you will.
Right. I was, as I mentioned before, I was watching Dr. Hepburn. He said, oh, interesting. He said he's comparing it to the Crusades, the Middle Ages. And the Crusades weren't exactly the best times for anybody. And many people were killed by the Crusaders, and especially the innocent Jewish communities who were picked on and destroyed by these Crusaders, who weren't exactly the best of all people. And then they ruined their own movement. And to this day, the Crusaders don't have a good name. And that's exactly what's happening now. This crusade of trying to teach people about climate change has really been done, as you've seen, as you've shown, and I believe it. And from that, this is an agenda created years ago to reduce population, to create eugenics, to reduce the energy for the have-nots, to make sure that those who are in power stay in power, and to make the world basically a one world government. And we see now that everyone's talking about the Great Reset. It's out in the open. Everyone can just Google it, see all the videos mentioning the Great Reset, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's talked about by world leaders. World leaders are saying Great Reset over and over and over again. I mean, if people said it in their basement, I can understand it's conspiracy theory. But when you have world leaders from the World Bank and the World Forum and Economic Forum and the UN and other leaders from different countries, and at political different at the summit meetings, so forth, saying Great Reset over and over again, it's telling you something. And the fact we had this lockdown, and we've seen that during the year that carbon dioxide increased when there was no basically activity of man-made production comparatively. So that would have been the best proof to show, hey, carbon dioxide should have gone down. It didn't go down. So it really, carbon dioxide and the climate change and all so forth, it's not man-made, it's natural made. So there's an agenda here about what's really going on. And the fact that
I think this might explain a recent cartoon I saw.
Yeah.
Cervantes, Don Quixote.
Yeah.
There was a recent cartoon in a magazine that showed John Kerry look-alike on a horse with his hand in the air, waving to a windmill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Don Quixote, exactly. And
yeah.
Don Quixote, I wish to bless you, and I wish you that you succeed in your endeavors. And I ask all the viewers, please look carefully and if you have to watch this interview a few times, watch a few times. There are scientific terms here that have been mentioned. It may be complicated, but there will be links to the climatesite.com to further discuss these scientific concepts in layman's terms, and if you have to read the article twice, read it twice or three times, or eventually I can guarantee you, like anything, the more you read something, the more you learn about it, the more you'll be able to understand it. Now, we ourselves, we don't take energy, as seriously as we should, because people think, you just go to the supermarket nowadays and there it is. There's the food. You go to a store, there's the shoes. But all these things take a great deal of man-made ingenuity, man-made organization, institutions to get even a cup of water. It's not so simple. You have to go, someone has to create the plant, and someone has to buy the land, and someone has to get the plumbing, and then someone has to create the energy to move that water, and then someone has to put the bottle it and make a machine to make all the printing on the bottled water, and then to transport it and then come to market. Takes a great deal of energy. And then the other types of energy. And this conversation is about energy, it's about people, and the quest to save this planet that we all want to do. If you anything else you want to tell the audience about your climate site, about what you're doing, and anything else that we should understand, that this is paramount to our lives right now, and we should have a different type of way of looking at the situation.
Well, yeah, getting back to the cartoon with John Kerry and the windmills, the point of the cartoon was that he was endorsing and looking at something that had no hope of working. That was the analogy.
Mm-hmm.
The false notion of the Green New Deal. Very important. We really have to understand that in order to sustain a population of 7.8 billion, which I think is where we're at the last time I looked,
Mm-hmm.
which is about a day ago, we're at 7.8 billion. And in order to sustain 7.8 billion people, we need an awful lot of food. And I don't know about you, but I would prefer a nice kosher steak, to gefilte fish. But it takes a great deal of energy to raise the crops necessary to feed the beef that the steak comes from. And then once that beef is raised, you need transportation and process capability in order to move things around and produce that beef and do all those things necessary to get it to the people that eat it. So on the one hand, food is the most important thing necessary to support a lot of people, but actually energy is more necessary because you can't produce large amounts of food without that energy. Mm-hmm. So kind of my concluding thought. And if we let this silly notion of man-produced climate change affect our ability to produce food, that's a real problem. That's eugenics by definition.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just say one thing to add to that, people try to think they can be God, that they can rule and they can judge and they have solutions. Let God be God. But we human beings have to take care of the planet the way God gave us our job. That being the case, then, we don't have to use murder or genocide to solve these problems. We are smart individuals. We were created in God's image. We have a great deal of talent. If we can go to the moon and create smartphones and all these things and such medicine, we can find a way that we can save the planet without eugenics, without population reduction, without scaring people, and to remind people that no one has to lose their lives to save the planet. And
the planet, I said this earlier, the planet does not need saving.
That's
There's
right.
nothing wrong with the planet.
That's exactly the point.
Fine.
Excellent. That's exactly the point.
What we have to save is man's ability to prosper and thrive at great numbers. As I said, it takes a lot of energy to support 7.8 billion people. But we are not harming the earth in any way, shape, or form.
That's beautiful. That's exactly the way
that's a false notion.
That's exactly what I want to tell the audience right now. Did you hear that right now? The planet is not in danger. Humanity is in danger.
Humanity's in danger. Millions of years before humans evolved on the earth, billion years before life forms evolved on the planet, the earth was a big rock. And if there are any aliens from other worlds flying around, they looked at that big rock. And if those same aliens, a billion years later, flew and saw the earth today, the rock would look roughly the same. The atmosphere might have changed, the color of the sky might be a little bit different, but we are not harming the earth. And if we build I've been to China 12 times, and I've taken people to the Great Wall numerous times. We can see the Great Wall from the moon. But the interesting thing is the Great Wall was built many, many, many hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, and it is decaying. And in another 1,000 years, you're not going to be able to see where that Great Wall was. It will have decayed, certainly 2,000 years. The same thing for New York City and skyscrapers and metal buildings. All of these things that man produces, they're very short term. They will decay. And once they have decayed, the evidence of our existence here on Earth will be not. No one would know. No future alien would ever know. So our prime responsibility should really be, as I said a few minutes ago, thriving and prospering in great numbers, and not worrying about the state of this beautiful planet that you have a picture of behind you.
You summed it up beautifully. It's not that the Earth is in danger. It's humanity is in danger. Human beings are in danger. That's really in danger.
Exactly.
And
if you live on an Earth where the largest, where the most intelligent life form that remains is a rhinoceros, that's fine. But what have we done in so doing? We protected the rhinoceroses, but we killed ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's very profound. So again, to tell the audience, to understand what we just learned, the Earth is not in trouble. The Earth will keep on going on for thousands of years. Have no fear about that. What isn't serious, what is in trouble is humanity, the human world, the world of 7 billion people. We as human beings have to make sure there's more people, not less people. Make sure that there is more chances for humanity to survive, not to disappear. And like you mentioned before, that everything decays. In 2,000 years, all the buildings will just will disappear if we're not there to be there, because things just disappear physically, and they just disintegrate. And if we're not there, there'll be no recollection that there was any human history. And we have to make sure that we're still there, still in 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 years from now. And only by proposing and carrying out what you're saying is focusing on the human condition, the humanity, not eugenics and not population reduction, and not this false nonsense of climate change, which doesn't exist at all. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us and for your passion. And I encourage everyone, please contribute, help, sustain, and make Mango the movie come true. It's a great dream and a great movie, a great vehicle that will really will change the course of human endeavors. I really believe that if we have everyone understand what really happened in the last 50 years, and the same token, how we can change the future by changing the present. Thank you so much for joining us today. A wonderful day, wonderful week, and Pesach is coming up. Have a wonderful Passover.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.